So far, between my Xbox and James's Xbox, we've reviewed multiple different controllers, all the way from some of the cheapest ones in the market for the Xbox to the most expensive one that's made by Microsoft with the Elite controller. And one that I see that keeps popping up on a bunch of different groups is the Turtle Beach Recon controller. And in this video, I'm going to go over if it's worth picking that controller up and if it's a good alternative to some of the other Pro controllers as well as some of the other more budget-friendly controllers for the Xbox. Let's take a look. Perfect. Turtle Beach Recon controller is pretty much marketed or designed for gamers who want something more than the generic standard Xbox controller, and the idea behind this is that everything is kind of built in centrally into this controller, like your audio settings, equalization settings, as well as standard customization options for both the button placement as well as the back paddles on this. The Recon itself comes wired. You can't get this in a wireless configuration, as I understand. It is a nice wire, though. They've made it seem more premium by packaging in a fabric style wire, which is a nice little touch to the controller itself. And to get started into the things I do like about this controller, the size itself is good compared to other controllers. It's just a little bigger, and I found that in some ways it was more comfortable than standard sized Xbox Series controllers. I also like that, unlike most of the wired controllers I've used, this one appears to have a little bit more of a heavier weighting to it, which just made it feel better when you were using it overall. And the biggest thing I always look for with these alternative controllers to the standard Xbox controllers is how the joysticks feel. And after having used this for some time, having played a bunch of different games on this, the joysticks themselves I thought were very well calibrated and felt really smooth, especially compared to some of the cheaper alternatives that you can get, because I've found with some of the PowerA controllers, for example, while you can get them for dirt cheap, the joysticks themselves reflect that, and this is not the case with this controller here. The other thing as well is the triggers themselves feel very responsive and feel smooth. I also like that the bumpers themselves don't have an overdone click to them, but they have a nice almost squishiness that just feels right when I'm playing games using this controller. Now, kind of the bigger meat and bones of this controller are the different modes that you have that you can use based off of the presets that are built into it or the customization that you want to do for this. So in other words, on the right half you have the actual controller presets. So this is the space where you can actually program in your different button configurations. Now, the way you do it is you hold down the mode button, the controller starts to flash, and then you map the buttons to the different spot that you want on the actual back paddles. This was pretty straightforward. I kind of fumbled around at first, but once I figured out it was pretty straightforward. You have 4 different presets that you can program into this controller. It appears that it saves inside the controller because I've tried between my son's Series S and Series X and our presets are saved, so that's pretty cool to me. There's also it's called a steady aim mode. As I understand, it kind of tightens up the dead zone a bit, so when you're aiming, it feels more precise. I thought this was more of a novelty feature. I know some people who reviewed this controller thought this was the end-all be-all. To me, it wasn't something that necessarily sold me on the controller overall, but it's a cool added touch for those who want it. Now, what I do really want to talk about are the audio settings. So just like the controller settings, you have different presets with the audio settings that you can also change. And I only used, because this can only be accommodated with a wired or packaged in wired headset. So the package we got came with the wired headset in the box as well. But using this headset, I thought it sounded really good. This review's not about that headset, but I thought the headset itself sounded very good, especially in comparison to my Xbox wireless headset. The big feature, though, of this controller is that you can change things on the fly, like the footsteps, for example. So in other words, you click this button and the equalizer sounds like it pretty much downshifts all the sounds and intensifies the sounds of things like footsteps, which I could understand in games like Gears of War, which is one of the ones that I tested on this. The pronounced sound of the footsteps was a very nice added advantage, and I thought was a really cool feature. And I could see for people who are playing games like Gears of War or of course Call of Duty seriously, this feature itself may be a game changer. Now technically you could probably set something up in your options with the equalizer settings on the Xbox to try to mimic this, but I found that myself, I probably wouldn't invest the time in it, but I definitely will continue using this preset when it comes to playing games on my Xbox. Now what I want to get into is kind of what I dislike about this controller. So I was a big fan of PDP's rematch controller, and part of the reason for that was PDP actually developed a program or app on the Xbox that you can map and remap and change all those settings on the console itself without really having to touch the controller. And that might sound trivial, but I found that was a lot more intuitive and easier for me to navigate and manage than it is trying to do it physically on the controller itself. And if you look at the Recon controller, while there is an app, it's not one that allows you to do that. It's only just to update the controller itself and update the controller firmware. That's it. So that kind of sucked and was a bit of a downside. The other thing is, well, the bulk of the controller, the buttons, the triggers, the back paddles, the joysticks all feel good. I thought the D-pad was the worst of the D-pads that I've used, between even the cheaper Power A D-pad all the way up to anything else that I have like the Elite Controller's D-pad. I thought the D-pad just felt pretty flimsy and felt pretty cheap overall, which was something that to me might not be a deal breaker for most people, but for the few games that you may employ this, that might be a decision that you want to make when it comes to the controller itself. The other thing as well is, I don't know what it is, but the rumble in this controller feels almost slightly delayed, and it feels weak overall. Now that's not usually something I think about or really put much stock into, but when it's not that great, I've definitely noticed it on this controller. And for some people, this again might be something that's a bit of a deal breaker. For me, it wasn't a major issue, but it was definitely something I noticed, and it did detract from the overall quality of this controller. The last thing is, while I like the nice fabric wire that was packaged in, it is a shame that there isn't a wireless version or option available for this, because I know for some people playing wired is not appealing at all, and that might be a deterrent for some gamers when it comes to picking up an alternative controller. Overall, however, this controller is currently on pretty good pricing. We picked this up with a headset for $50, so to me this was holding tremendous value. And if you're looking for the controller itself, I've seen on places like Amazon, I've seen at Walmart, this controller goes as low as $40. And if that's what you're spending on this controller, I think this is a very good controller. I would argue it's superior to the original Xbox Series controller, but it's definitely not on par with the Elite controller. It kind of sits somewhere in the middle there. So if you're looking for a pro-level gaming controller, I would argue that this controller holds a tremendous amount of value, and some of the features like the audio modes that are built into it will definitely give you a bit of an edge when it comes to playing some of these games seriously online. So overall, I'm relatively impressed with this controller, and I think there's a lot of great things to be said about it, despite some of the small points that I made that I disliked about it. So if you already own this controller or are considering getting it, definitely let me know what you think in the comments below.